All right. Hey guys. Hope y'all are doing okay. Hope everybody can see me okay. I've got a quick confession to make before we jump into the lecture. By the way, if you have a question during the lecture, just type your question into the chat box, and I will try to make sure that um, that I get to the questions. Um, Periodically, I'll try to make sure I look down. But I have a confession to make. Got done a little early today. Came home. You know those times in your life where you take a nap and you die? Literally, you just die, and then you come back to life, an hour and a half later, and you can kind of tell that you died. So that's the kind of nap I took today. Woke up and I had like 5 missed calls from my family. Apparently, my family thought that I died. I did. I died. So anyway, so I am post death nap. So let's see if we can do this. Let's see what coming back from the dead does for my lecture. How about that? All right. So we have a lot of information to cover. This is, I think, our, fourth lecture of the semester. The disadvantage of taking online classes is that we don't get to interact as much as I would like. So we try to make the best of it by using technology. And thank God for technology, like Zoom, which is great. I like Zoom better, but you can't record. I mean, you can record the Zooms, but they don't last forever. They only last for 30 days. So it's a great platform for us to engage, but YouTube Live seems to last. YouTube lasts a lot longer. So this is this is a lecture 4, History of the Christian Church, Elim Bible Institute and College. So this is, we have a ton of information to cover in this lecture that spans, over 1,000 years, so almost 1,500 years. And so what I tried to do for this lecture is really pull out some of the most important things that we need to really understand to set the stage for the Protestant Reformation. That was sort of the request that came in from you guys, that I focus on that. And it came at a good time because this was really the next lecture anyway. Hey, Gabriel, I see you took a nap today too. So that's 2 resurrections before Easter besides Jesus. So good job, buddy. All right. So here's the information that we're going to cover. So we're going to start the discussion towards the end of the medieval period. And we're going to cover sort of from the end of the medieval period right up to the Protestant Reformation. When I say right up to the Protestant Reformation, we will cover some of the major events and people all the way up to the event that caused Martin Luther to finally do what he did, what he is most famous for, and that is to initiate the Protestant Reformation. So we're going to talk about what many consider to be one of the darkest period in Western Christianity and the darkest days of the papacy. We'll talk about some of the key players, so on and so forth. So that's kind of where we're headed. So if you've done your reading in the textbook and you've done the reading on the medieval period, also called the Middle Ages, so you'll see both of those terms meant to reflect the same time period. And it's important that you understand that the term medieval or Middle Ages almost exclusively refers to a period of time between roughly 500 CE and 1400 CE, the end of 1400 up to 1500, 1400 to 1500 CE. Some 500 to 1400 is this period of time that refers almost exclusively to Western Europe, maybe some of North Africa, maybe into some of the Balkan states. But it's essentially, when you think medieval, you think Western Europe, France, Germany, Italy, England, the Netherlands, Switzerland. Czech Republic. So you think of those areas. So it's these events and these people from 500 to 1400 that the term really reflects not just religious, but it reflects the social, the political, the religious, the cultural life. And so if you're thinking about European history, you have the Middle Ages or the medieval period, followed by the Reformation. Or I'm sorry, the Renaissance. And then the Renaissance, you sort of move into the Age of Enlightenment. Then you get to the 20th century, after the Age of Enlightenment, or the 19th century, up to where we are now. So so let's just kind of survey some of the notable events in the Middle Ages. So from 500 to 1400, what Western Europe saw, and that's how we kind of refer to it, either Europe or Western Europe. We saw the fall of the Western Roman Empire. In that span of 1400, 1500 years, we saw really longer than that. We saw Christianity become the dominant religion in Europe. It's important that you guys understand that unless you were Jewish or unless you were a Muslim just living in Europe, everyone practiced Christianity. And not just practiced Christianity as it was set forth by the Roman bishop, by the Pope. So all of these, everyone, it doesn't matter where you went, anywhere in Europe, you were going to be under the jurisdiction of the Roman bishop. So in this time, in the Middle Ages, we saw Islam spread up into Spain from the 700s to 1492. And we're going to talk about feudalism in just a minute, more specifically, but in the Middle Ages, feudalism became the chief economic and social platform for Western Europe. In this time period, the doctrine of papal authority, as a result of Petrine succession, you guys understand that term, right? Or that phraseology where the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, began to teach that that office was a direct succession from the Apostle Peter. So in the Middle Ages, that theology really ramped up and became really, in terms of Western Christianity, became orthodoxy. Another issue regarding the Pope in the Middle Ages, you had this concept of papal theory. And so what papal theory states, I don't know if you read this in your textbook or not, but what papal theory states is that you have two authorities. You have the church, which the Pope sat at the head of the church, according to Roman Christianity. And then you had the temporal authority or civil authority. And so under papal theory, they considered civil authority a consequence of man's sinful nature. So according to papal theory, the Pope was the dispenser of God's grace on earth. And the civil authority was a necessary evil because man was prone to sinful acts and sinful deeds. And so you had to have civil authority to help deal with and minimize man's sinfulness. So in terms of the two different authorities, papal theory would state, and this all developed in the Middle Ages, papal theory would state that the Pope, as the head of the Christian church, was superior to the civil authority. At the same time that papal authority, in terms of how the clergy began to see their authority, at the same time, monarchs, these would be kings and princes, and as the feudal system emerged, you had these other upper classes, the nobility. but at the same time, papal theory was being sort of ingrained into the ideology and theology of Western Christianity. Monarchs began to express to their subjects that they ruled by divine right, meaning that monarchs were placed in their positions because God willed it. And it was so any monarch that reigned over their kingdom because they were God's instrument to those people. And so you had two competing sort of ideologies that emerged sort of at the same time. If I had to, if they were in a race, I would say that papal theory probably started a little earlier, but by the middle of the medieval period, what you really had was you had kings thinking they ruled by divine right, and the Pope thinking that kings were subject to the Pope uh, because of divine authority. So obviously, this caused problems, right? Um, so one of the other things that was a that was big during the medieval period was monasticism was really at its height in the Middle Ages. Another thing is, we kind of take the idea of the Catholic Mass for granted. It's important that you think about Christianity, that you constantly think about the history of Christianity when you think about things that are happening in the history of Christianity. When Peter stood up on the day of Pentecost and he preached a sermon launching the Christian church, right? As Christianity developed, people would meet in their homes because there were no buildings, right? And they would meet in their homes, and the primary reason they would meet would be to have communion, to celebrate the martyrs, and someone, typically not always the same person, would maybe read one of Paul's letters or Peter's letters, or read the book of James, or read one of the Gospels, and maybe just kind of talk on it. So the sermon developed, a little later, and as Christianity became more accepted in the Roman Empire, and Christians had churches, they still were mainly gathering to celebrate communion and those other things. Then you had the schism in 1054, and in the Western side, developing their meeting around communion changed. Although communion was still the main reason that they went, there were other things that they were celebrating, and this was called the Mass, celebrating the Mass. And so in the medieval period, in the Western Church, the Mass developed as really the chief expression of Christianity. So if I was a farmer and I went to Mass on Sundays, it was the same thing every single Sunday. And it was really the chief expression of my Christianity. There was no Bible reading in the home. There may be prayers at home. There were weddings, there were funerals. And then other traditions developed, like confession, things like that. But going to Mass was really the chief expression of Christianity. And as you probably know, because of your reading, communion wasn't even offered every time to all the people. But the Mass is important because it really developed. So you go to a Roman Catholic church today, and the Mass has changed over the years, but the Mass is still the chief religious activity of Roman Catholics, much in the same way that among Protestants, going to church on Sunday is the chief religious activity. And we can argue in our theology classes whether that's right or wrong, but that is what it is. So you've got all these things that are emerging. One of the other things, and this helped Protestantism, something we call scholasticism, really emerged in the West through the formation of universities. If you go to Oxford, England, I think Oxford, you have all the colleges associated with Oxford, but Oxford University, I think it was founded in the 1200s. Like, Oxford's been around as long as what the Incans or the Mayans. Like, it's been around for for centuries. Oxford and some of the other colleges developed in pursuit of what we call scholasticism. And these colleges were built, and priests were put into these colleges to teach theology. That's why they were built, to teach formal theology. Probably, I apologize for scratching my nose. I don't know why my nose itches tonight. My mother was very superstitious. I think I'm trying to remember what she would say about your nose itching. I think it meant someone was talking about you. Some of these superstitions. My mother, by the way, this is free. This is not part of your tuition payment. My mother was very superstitious. She wasn't a Christian, and very superstitious about walking under ladders or black cats crossing your path. And even before I became a Christian, I thought some of the superstitions were the dumbest things in the world. So as a kid, I'd walk under ladders just to watch my mom freak out. But anyway, mom said that if your nose is itching, someone's talking about you or something like that. So stop talking about me, please. All right. So scholasticism emerged, probably one of the most famous people engaged in sort of the rise of scholasticism was Thomas Aquinas, probably the most dominant figure in the scholastic movement. Obviously, the Crusades happened during those Middle Ages. The papal seat was moved during the Middle Ages. It was moved from Rome to France, back to Rome. So by the end of the 14th century, the Turks, which became the Ottoman Empire, the Turks were threatening Asia Minor. They had taken Constantinople, so now the Roman Empire was gone. Roman Empire no more. In the West, secularism really was undermining religious authority. So what you had, as you saw the decline of the Middle Ages and the rise of the Renaissance, in that sort of transition time, what you began to see is everyone went from being with religion being the chief ideology to secularism becoming more of an ideology. So this idea of secularism began to undermine some of that religious authority. This is some of the things you see towards the end of the 14th century. So at the same time, the papacy was really at its peak in terms of religious authority. And towards the end of the 14th century, you really begin to see people begin to speak out against some of the abuses and against some of the corruption and scandal that we're going to discuss in just a minute. So that's a picture of where Western Europe is, where Christianity is towards the end of the Middle Ages. Because technically, the Reformation really took place during the Renaissance. I know the 1500s, much of Europe was still kind of in those Middle Ages, but beginning to come out. So let's talk about something that really set the stage for religious life during the Middle Ages in Europe, in Western Europe, and that's feudalism. So feudalism was probably one of the biggest, the end of feudalism, I guess I should say, was probably one of the biggest transformations of social and economic life in Europe prior to the Reformation. I really don't think, I'm not even sure, you read, the New Testament says that in the fullness of time, Jesus came, right? I think it says it in Galatians, the fullness of time, Jesus came. Well, you also start to look at these other big events in Christianity, and as you review those big events and you look at the events leading up to that, you begin to see some things happening that you wonder, would the Reformation even have happened without scholasticism? Would it have happened without the end of feudalism? Because what feudalism did, and we're going to talk about it more specifically in just a minute, what feudalism did was it ordered society in a way that created a hierarchy where the bulk of the people were at the bottom of the hierarchy, and the church was at the top of the hierarchy. So here's what feudalism was. So it's an economic system where the monarch, the king. So in a monarchy, England, Saudi Arabia, in a monarchy, the king owns all the land in the country, every acre, right? So in feudalism, what the monarchy does is the monarchy divides the land and gives large tracts of land to the nobles. So I want you to think hierarchy. When I say hierarchy, so at the top would be the monarch. Then the monarch would divide the land and give it to the next level in the hierarchy, the nobles, the lords and the ladies. So the lords and the ladies would take this land and they would promise certain things to the king. They would promise to share revenue. They would promise to provide soldiers if the king needed to go to war. It's the nobles, the lords and the ladies, that would provide the army. That's why if you watch these movies about wars that would take place in medieval Europe, you would see various armies fighting under a certain banner. And that banner was typically the banner of whatever noble they lived under. So you had the monarchy, had all the land, divided the land into huge tracts, gave it to the nobles, and the nobles would in turn subdivide the land into tracts, and they would place a fief in charge of these subdivisions. So these are like middle managers. So they're not nobility, they're just under nobility. The fiefs in turn would oversee all the other people. And if you weren't a fief, a lord or lady, or a monarch, you were a serf/peasant. So we tend to say peasant to reflect the impoverished. That is mostly true in feudalism because the peasants were at the bottom of the hierarchy. If you've studied Hinduism and you've studied the caste system in Hinduism, you have several castes from highest to lowest. The feudal system was probably the closest that we've seen in the Western world to the caste system, because what it did was it ordered society according to birthright, right? Because kings were kings by birthright, so they ordered it according to birthright. You were born a monarch, or you were born a lord or lady, or you were born a fief, or you were born a peasant, and everybody had their responsibilities. So the serfs and the peasants down here at the bottom would work the land, and they would give portions of their crops and livestock to the nobles, who would in turn give portions of the crops and the livestock to the monarch. So the economic system that existed in Western Europe in those Middle Ages was bartering. You had coin, you had some gold, but really the chief trait in the economic system was bartering, right? And so by the 14th to 15th century, we see a shift in the economy in Western Europe, and we begin to see the nobles. They're not subdividing their land as much and giving it to other people to oversee, but they're doing private farming, because what's beginning to happen is people are beginning to migrate to the cities. When people begin to migrate to the cities, it's not as much of an agrarian community, right? People aren't just farming. People have to develop other skills. You begin to see coin money that becomes the basis for the economy. So people aren't trading crops and trading livestock for goods and services. They're paying money for it. Nobles are selling their crops for money. So over a period of a few hundred years, you see the decline of feudalism and the rise of capitalism. So let's talk about from a religious perspective, what feudalism meant for Christianity. I've already said that the vast majority of the people were serfs and peasants. The people that actually did the work in the economy were serfs and peasants. They did all the fighting in the wars. They grew all the crops. They grew all the livestock. They did all the work, right? They were the craftsmen. They were the blacksmiths, right? The peasants and the serfs did all the work. So under feudalism, if you were a peasant or a serf in an economy that relies on bartering, right, trading goods and services, then you are very limited in regards to how wealthy you can become. But once the economy moves from bartering, where I'm trading goods and services, to collecting coin and paying for things, well, it changes. It changes whether or not I'm always a serf or a peasant, right? In fact, those terms finally go away. But from a religious perspective, during the Middle Ages, under feudalism, you saw a lot of asceticism. You saw people going into monasticism. Some of the people we're going to talk about towards the end of the lecture, John Huss, John Wycliffe, some of these priests would go into the priesthood to escape being a serf or being a peasant. So they would go into the monasteries. And so the monasteries were full in the Middle Ages, doing charity work, taking in unwanted children, right? Leading the contemplative life, leading the ascetic life. And so in the Middle Ages, the average Christian was very otherworldly, meaning that getting out of bed every day was about survival. We have to do what we do today to survive, to live. There's no concept of getting ahead. There's no concept of, hey, I'm in this economic position now, but I see myself in 10 years being in this second. There's none of that. Is we get out of bed every day, we do our work so that we can live. If we don't do our work today, if we don't make sure that the pests are not eating the crops, or the weeds aren't taking over the crops, or if we don't make sure that the cattle are well fed and watered, then we could die. And so existence for serfs and peasants was a lowly existence. So asceticism and otherworldliness gave the people some sense of control over their lives. Well, as feudalism begins to die, as the economy becomes more coin-based, and there's this idea that, wait a minute, I can get ahead, then there's less thought of otherworldliness. And when there's less thought of otherworldliness, then you tend to think about the here and now. And that's secularism, thinking about the here and now and not religious. So that is a huge shift in thinking. And all of this is happening, guys, right before the Protestant Reformation. So this is the stage that is set. So as the European economy becomes more reliant on money, you begin to see the literacy rate rise. It's important that you remember that in the Middle Ages, almost everyone was illiterate. And this may surprise you, but even the local parish priest, for the most part, was illiterate. They had memorized the Mass in Latin, really sometimes didn't even know what they were saying. There was no concept of the priest reading the Bible and trying to determine what the scriptures say. There was no idea that. Being a priest was a functional thing. You married, you buried, you did the Mass, you would see people at the end of their life for that last confession, that unction. You would take confession. It was all function, really. There was really very little practical spiritual aspect. Not that the priests weren't spiritual. I don't mean it that way. I just mean that being a priest was less about what does God have to say to me for me to say to the people, and more about these are the tasks that I perform. And many priests took those tasks very seriously. And so I don't want you to think that Western Christianity was without any spirituality, because that's just not the case. That's not true. So, but as the Middle Ages begin to end, as feudalism begins to end, Western Europe is taken in by a high interest in secularism and a love of money. And this love of money infected everyone from the bottom of the hierarchy up to the Pope. And so that's kind of where we are moving into the 1400s and 1500s. All right. So if you have questions, type those in. Make sure you guys get that. Make sure you understand that. If you need a clarification on any of that, just hit me up in the chat. But let's keep moving, and I'll keep an eye on the chat. But let's talk about towards the end of the Middle Ages, what was the state of the papacy? I think it's fair to say that the Bishop of Rome at this time in the 1500s was probably the most powerful, one of the most powerful people on the planet. Like, think about some of the people that lived during this time, and I just think that you'll be hard pressed to find a person that exercised as much power as the Roman bishop. Think about it. So the Pope was the supreme authority among Western Christians, and we've already established that Western Europe was all Christian, right? So the Pope was the supreme authority in Western Christianity and controlled all the wealth of the church, all of it. Now, with the exception of Jews and maybe a handful of Muslims that lived in Europe, nearly every person in Europe, in Western Europe, practiced Christianity, and they practiced it according to the dictates of the Pope. And so the Pope had the exclusive authority in the Western Church to excommunicate a person. When you excommunicate a person, you are saying you are no longer a part of the church. You're no longer in the kingdom of God. You no longer have access to salvation. And the Pope retained exclusively the right to excommunicate and to bar people, kings, princes, nobles, peasants, didn't matter. The Pope had the authority to bar people from communion, to bar them from the church, and to bar them from eternal salvation. And I just can't think of a more powerful position than to occupy one where everyone in a geographic area believes that you have the authority to send them to heaven or send them to hell. And I think that's pretty powerful. So as the church moved into the age of the Renaissance, the papacy began two practices that would create a ton of controversy and would just be a breeding ground for corruption. And here are those two practices. The first one is simony, S-I-M-O-N-Y, if you're trying to keep take notes. So what simony is, selling offices to the highest bidder. The Pope would have a position to fill. And I'm not talking about parish priest. I'm talking about bishop, archbishop. These positions would become available, and the Pope would sell the position to whoever had the most money. Now, it didn't start like that, right? You didn't go from Peter, James, and John doing things the way they did them, and the next day the Pope selling offices, right? That didn't happen in one step. But what happened was what became donations to the church, um, you know, prior to an appointment or after an appointment, became this expectation that if you wanted an appointment, you had to pony up. And then now finally, it's just a full blown unwritten rule that if you want a job, you have to pay for it. Simony. The other practice is nepotism, which we probably are more familiar with that term. That's where, your family members get favors and get jobs. So popes are giving lucrative offices to, for the most part, unworthy and unqualified nieces and nephews and children. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. If you hear me say that popes had children and you think, wait a minute, I thought popes were supposed to be celibate. Well, hang on. So simony and nepotism. Now, in regards to celibacy, in the Western Church, not in the East, right? In the East, priests, bishops could marry and have kids and have families. It was just a part of Christianity. But in the West, a trend developed, said that, you know what, if you're going to serve God, you need to be married to God. Like, if the call to ministry is a higher calling. It's a higher calling than a call to be married and have a family. So if you want to be in the ministry, you have to take a vow of celibacy, a vow of chastity, where you're going to abstain from physical sexual relations, and you're going to abstain from marriage. And so that was an expectation. It was a rule. It's canon law that the priesthood would not marry. And so by the time of the Renaissance, the clergy didn't marry, but it wasn't unusual for popes and bishops and even priests to have long-term mistresses and father several children. One of the worst examples, worst or best, depending on how you want to look at it, one of the worst examples of this. Now, there's a Netflix show. I don't know that it's historically accurate because I haven't seen it, but there's a Netflix show called The Borgias, Borgias, The Borgias. So there was a Spanish. So Rodrigo Borgia, when he was 25 years old, his uncle, who was Pope Calixtus III, when Rodrigo Borgia was 25 years old, the Pope made him a cardinal. Now, just in case you forget what the hierarchy is in the Roman Catholic Church, it's Pope, Cardinal, Archbishop, Bishop, right? So this 25-year-old who wasn't even old enough yet, really, was made a cardinal when he was, just because he was the Pope's nephew. And when Pope Calixtus died, Rodrigo Borgia convinced the College of Cardinals, which is the group that elects the Pope, to make him the Pope. So that's what they did. They voted in Rodrigo Borgia as the Pope, and he assumed the name Alexander VI. By the time he was Pope, not while he was Pope. You understand? When they elected him Pope, by that time, he had already fathered 10 children, at least 10 children, by a couple of different mistresses. And he had one very long-term mistress that was essentially a common law wife. And after he became Pope, he began appointing his children, his sons, to offices. He appointed his 18-year-old son, Caesar, to be a cardinal when the kid was 18 years old. And so you can imagine that by the time Borgia, or Alexander VI, by the time he passes away, by the time he dies, almost everything corrupt that you could imagine a leader doing, he did. It was probably one of the darkest periods in the history of Western Christianity. But he wasn't the only one. You had other popes that were doing similar things. They were fighting with monarchs. They were selling offices. They were raising families outside of Rome. They were it was the worst of times in Christianity. It was anything but Christianity, if you can imagine. And I forget the quote, but Machiavelli, if you've ever read Machiavelli had a statement, and you might want to Google it and check my accuracy on it. But Machiavelli said something similar to, um, um, Christians are like Christianity basically is a scam, um, without their God, or something like that. Like if you have Christianity without Jesus, then it's awful. And so, so you have all of this corruption, you have all this money. It's extravagant wealth. These archbishops, these cardinals, these popes were richer than kings. They were in the top wealth in the world, and could buy anything and could do anything, and they wielded power, and at some point the gospel of Jesus had nothing to do with the leadership of the Christian church in the West. So what began to happen as a result of scholasticism and this transformation of society, where it's not feudal anymore, it's a little more egalitarian, you had some people that began to speak up, and not a few, but there are two people that I want to talk about that spoke out against the abuses of power and the corruption in Rome, that really, really paved the way for the Protestant Reformation. So there were two forerunners to the Reformation. The first is John Wycliffe. Wycliffe was born in England in 1320. He was a professor at Oxford. So here we go, scholasticism, right? You have these professors, these doctors of theology that spend their days teaching theology. So he began writing tracts, these pamphlets, in both English and Latin that expressed his views of the church. They were very popular in England. They were very popular in other countries. And here are some of the things that he suggested in his pamphlets. Number one, he suggested that the clergy, from pope to priest, should occupy their positions according to biblical standards. Now, we read that and we think, well, of course they should. But this is how bad it was. Wycliffe was suggesting that the Christian church change the way they were doing things and begin selecting priests and bishops and archbishops and cardinals and popes based on biblical standards. Biblical standards had nothing to do with it. The other thing he wrote was that the clergy had become so secularized that, remember we talked about papal theory, where you have two authorities, the church authority and the secular authority, and that the secular authority exists to curtail the sinfulness of men, right? So what Wycliffe wrote in his pamphlets was that the Pope had become so secularized that he should fall under the authority of the civil government, because the civil government, according to Paul's writings, had been given authority by God over temporal matters, and the church was have dominion over spiritual matters, but the church had become so corrupt that they had no spiritual authority. So Wycliffe said the Pope and all the priests should be under the control of the temporal authorities. Wycliffe advocated for clergy to marry. He said celibacy was unbiblical. Wycliffe denied the doctrine of transubstantiation. If you remember us talking about that doctrine, that is the doctrine where in communion, the wine and the bread become the physical blood and the physical body of Jesus. And it's called transubstantiation. And so Wycliffe thought that transubstantiation should be denied. And again, this is all revolutionary ideas. And he taught that the Bible should be the chief source of authority for doctrinal and ecclesiological matters. So again, for us, we might, well, of course it should. But you have to remember, when he was writing in the 1300s, he was a voice in the wilderness as far as he was concerned. Now, he had a following, for sure. And also, he rejected indulgences. And I'm going to talk more about indulgences in just a minute. But he rejected indulgences and advocated for an English church. So John Wycliffe said that the English people should be under an English church, free from the Pope. Now, we know history, right? Henry VIII explored that idea in a way that really fulfilled, to a large extent, Wycliffe's dream that there be an English church, and that's why we have the Anglican Church today. Now, here's an interesting piece of trivia for you that's going to help you at Applebee's one night win trivia when this question's asked. But there are two figures in Christianity that Christians have used the term Antichrist to refer to. The first is the Roman emperor. It wasn't unusual for Christians to consider the Roman emperor the Antichrist. And the second person in the history of Christianity that Christians have used the term Antichrist to refer to is the Pope. And John Wycliffe referred to the Pope as the Antichrist. Now, you know probably what happened. The Pope read his tracts and thought, wow, Wycliffe's right. I repent. That is not what happened. The opposite happened. He was condemned as a heretic by Pope Urban VI, and he was sentenced to death, but he was protected by English nobility and eventually died of natural causes. So he was not executed, but he was excommunicated, and a sentence of death was issued against him. During this, I don't know if it's called exile, this time when he's excommunicated, Wycliffe actually translated the Bible from Greek, the New Testament from Greek into English. So that's the first real translation in the Western Church out of Greek, or the Latin Vulgate, is Wycliffe's translation of the English Bible. So that's John Wycliffe. And the second forerunner to the Reformation is John Huss. Now, John Huss was a Bohemian student. Now, when we say Bohemian, I don't know if you know what that means or not. People from the Czech Republic, from Prague, are typically referred to as Bohemian. It's a term that is mostly geographic, but it has become a term to reflect sort of an approach to life and this cultural designation. But Bohemian, for our purposes, means someone from the Czech Republic, from Prague. So these Bohemian students would go to Oxford and were significantly influenced by Wycliffe. They returned to Prague and they started their own attempts at reform in the Czech Republic. But they didn't emphasize as many things as Wycliffe emphasized. They mainly emphasized celebrating communion more frequently, because in Mass they didn't always celebrate communion every week. The people didn't always get to participate, and they emphasized this moral reform. They wanted to see moral reform among Christians, particularly the clergy. So John Huss was a priest at Prague's largest church, at Bethlehem Temple. And he delivered sermons there in his native language, in the native Czech language. So he did not do the Mass in Latin. He did it in his native language, the Czech language, which already had him at odds with the papacy, because the rule was the Mass is done in Latin. Well, he began to read Wycliffe's pamphlets, and he began to be influenced by these Bohemian reformers, and he just dove headfirst into trying to reform the Roman Church. And um, and he didn't live and write as long as Wycliffe, so he didn't get to make as big an impact while he was alive as Wycliffe, but he emphasized some of the same things. Number one, he denounced the sale of indulgences. Again, if you don't remember what an indulgence is, we're going to talk about them in just a minute. He preached against the immorality of the clergy, spoke out against simony and nepotism, right? Selling these offices, giving these offices to unworthy and unqualified um, relatives. He proclaimed that the Bible was the only authority for doctrine and ecclesiological matters. And guess what else he did? He referred to the Pope as the Antichrist. He was excommunicated by Alexander V, and he was ordered to appear before the Council of Constance. Said, "No way, Jack. You're not getting me in front of that council. I know how that ends." But the Holy Roman Emperor, basically the King of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor convinced Huss, you should go and you should make a defense for yourself and for the reforms that you want. So he decided, okay, I'll go. And so he went to the Council of Constance. As soon as he showed up in the city, they arrested him, placed him in prison, had a trial, declared that he was a heretic, and then burned him alive in 1415. And here's something that's interesting. In the early 1500s, when Martin Luther was a monk, way before the Protestant Reformation, he was in the library and at his monastery, and he came across a volume of sermons by someone named John Huss. And Martin Luther read all of those sermons. And years later, he reflects on when he read Huss's sermons. And here's what Martin Luther said later about how he felt when he was reading those sermons for the first time. Luther said, "I was overwhelmed with astonishment. I could not understand for what cause they had burnt so great a man, who explained the scriptures with so much gravity and skill." Wycliffe was in academics, right? He wrote extensively. He taught, right? He had all this influence in the classroom. But Huss was a pastor. He was a preacher. And by all accounts, a fantastic preacher, where he didn't just deliver the mass, but he exhorted according to the scriptures. And Huss had significant impact on Martin Luther. All right, so we've talked about some of the trends in the Middle Ages. We talked about feudalism, how important it was to the religious life, and how the decline of feudalism and the rise of the capitalist economy really started to see a rise in scholasticism and secularism. You had these competing ideas between the papacy and the monarch about which was the greater authority. And in the midst of all of that, you had corruption in the leadership of the Christian church that really was unmatched before or after that age. But the corrupt issue that was I don't know if you've heard this saying, the straw that broke the camel's back, meaning that you just keep putting straw on a camel's back, and eventually one of those straws is going to make the pile too heavy and it's going to break the camel's back. So the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back was the selling of indulgences. So let's talk about that. So we have, in the late 1400s, early 1500s, you have all of these issues we've talked about that emerged and that sort of found their expression in one person simony, nepotism, corruption, the selling of indulgences. It all sort of came to a head in one person. So let's talk about it. So an indulgence, just to make sure that we all are on the same page, an indulgence, although there were other things you could do with an indulgence, primarily what an indulgence was I pay a sum of money and I get a promissory note. I get an indulgence, a writ of indulgence that says that whomever I am donating money on behalf of, this money for the purchase of this indulgence, the indulgence means that my loved one could be released from purgatory into heaven sooner. The more money I spend on the indulgence, the quicker the person could be released into heaven. Now, the Catholic Church has, in Vatican I and II, reformed this sort of thing. But indulgences still exist. If you are a Roman Catholic and you have a loved one that dies, you can donate money to the church for the priest to pray for your loved one to get out of purgatory sooner. That's a type of indulgence. So there was a noble in Germany, Prince Albert of Brandenburg, had no formal theological training or anything. When he was 23, not 30, you have to be 30 by canon law to be an archbishop. When he was 23, Pope Leo X appointed him to be the Archbishop of Magdeburg. He also appointed him to be the Bishop of Halberstadt. So Albert was given two positions, bishop and archbishop. Now, according to canon law, it was against the law so there was a policy against pluralism. Pluralism means that you hold more than one position in the clerical hierarchy. So the clerical hierarchy was pope, cardinal, archbishop, bishop, priest, right? You couldn't hold more than one position. You couldn't be a priest and a bishop. You couldn't be a bishop and an archbishop, which is what Leo did for Albert. Albert paid for these positions. Went to Leo X and said, here's money. Here's what I want. Leo said, let's make it happen. And Leo appointed him to be an archbishop and a bishop. But Albert was incredibly ambitious. So after some time, he petitioned Pope Leo, said, I would also like to be the Archbishop of Mainz. This is all in Germany. So Leo says, I'm open to that, but it's going to cost you. So Albert went to the Fugger Bank, went to a bank, and took out a loan so that he could pay Leo for the position. But this was an expensive position. You're asking for 3 positions. Your loan from the bank is not going to cover it. So what Leo does is Leo devises a plan for Albert to raise the necessary funds to buy his position. He authorized the sale of an indulgence to anyone that contributed to the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Now, my wife and I, my oldest daughter, we went to Rome for my daughter's high school graduation. This was 5 years ago because she's been out of college for a year. So me and Jessica and Rebecca, we go to Greece, stand on Mars Hill where Paul preached. It was great. Went to Corinth, went to Athens. It's my first trip out of the country. And we went to Italy, went to Rome, went to Vatican City. And we toured St. Peter's Basilica. We went and saw all the stuff you see, right? That building that stands in Vatican City, St. Peter's Basilica, that building, the one that's there now, was built on the sale of indulgences. So Leo X says to Albert, all right, I'm going to authorize the sale of indulgences in Germany. You sell as many of these as you can. Basically, you tell the people, if you donate money for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, we will give you an indulgence. The more money you donate, the quicker your loved one is going to get out of purgatory. So the more money you get, the quicker the indulgence works. So Albert said, we'll do it. But the plan was, Leo's plan was, okay, Albert, you go sell those indulgences. When all the money comes in, half of it is going to go to pay your bank loan. The other half is going to come to me, and I'll use it for whatever I want. And he used most of it to build St. Peter's Basilica. So what Albert did, being the entrepreneur, was he hired a band of priests and friars to begin selling indulgences on commission. So I give you a percentage of what you sell. And he hired this friar whose name was John Tetzel. And John Tetzel missed his calling when he became a friar because he should have been a salesman. Because what Tetzel did was he went around and he raised millions of dollars on behalf of Albert and the Pope in the selling of these indulgences. And Tetzel developed a jingle, like a commercial, a jingle that people would repeat, and it became a slogan to help him sell indulgences. And his jingle, or his little slogan, was, now regarding the money. So money was given, and he would open a chest and he would put the money in the chest, and then you would hear a clink, right? You hear a clink because the coins are clinking against each other. Tetzel's slogan was, as soon as the money clinks in the chest, the soul moves from purgatory into heavenly rest. He developed a jingle and an ad campaign to sell indulgences to people so they could get their loved ones out of purgatory. Tetzel did most of his selling in Brandenburg, which was very close to the town of Wittenberg, where Martin Luther was both a priest and a professor at the University of Wittenberg. And it was the selling of indulgences that caused Martin Luther to consider not just indulgences, but everything he thought he knew about the Catholic Church, and to write 95 different theses that he wanted to debate. And he nailed those 95 theses on October 31st to the door of the Wittenberg Castle, sparking the Protestant Reformation. So that's all the events from the Middle Ages all the way up to the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. All right. And that's the lecture for tonight. So here's where you're going to go from here, right? You're going to, if you haven't already, you're going to dive into the Protestant Reformation. You're going to read about Martin Luther. You're going to read about Ulrich Zwingli. You're going to read about John Calvin. Now, unfortunately, and I've got, I don't know, look around my office. I probably have 10 history of Christianity books, like general history of Christianity, not including like women in the history of Christianity or African Christianity, like these subsections of history of Christianity. Most of them offer very little information on Jacobus Arminius. So I tell you what I might do, and the reason I might do it is because here at Elim, we find ourselves more aligned with Jacobus Arminius than we do with John Calvin. So what I might do, I'll look at the syllabus. I probably already have it. Honestly, I know myself well enough. I probably already have it in the syllabus, but I will probably do a lecture really highlighting the differences between the theology of John Calvin and the theology of Jacob Arminius. But I'll tell you what you're going to find when you read John Calvin. There's a difference between the Calvin that pastored in Geneva. He's basically a theocrat, pastored in Geneva, and when he was 27, wrote the Institutes of Christian Religion. There's a difference between that guy and the modern expression of Calvinism. Calvinism's grown to become something a little different. If you talk to a Calvinist, they'll say it's no different at all. In the same way, if you talk to a Methodist, they'll say there's no difference between modern Methodism and Wesley, but there is. But I want to make sure you guys understand those two differences, because initially Calvin had significantly more impact than really any other reformer. And Arminianism really struggled as a belief system. I would argue, somebody probably debate me on this, but I would argue that Arminius probably was popularized by Wesley. So today, in the world among Protestants, Calvinism went from being the predominant Protestant view in the 1600s, 1700s. Calvinism went from being the dominant Protestant view to being a minority view, and Wesleyanism and Arminianism is the dominant view in Christianity. It is not the dominant view in evangelical Christianity in the United States and parts of Europe. Calvinism is still the dominant evangelical view. That's why if you go to an evangelical church in the United States, it's probably going to be really influenced by John Calvin. I go to a non-denominational church in Jacksonville. We came out of the Methodist church, but our pastor was raised Southern Baptist, went to I think he went to a Southern Baptist seminary. And so a lot of our doctrine at our church leans Calvinist. I'm not a Calvinist, but I attend this church, and it really doesn't matter. But anyway, that gets us all the way from the Middle Ages to Protestant Reformation. Hope you've enjoyed the lecture. Hope you've gotten something out of it. I'm going to close this thing in about 30 seconds, unless you have a question. So if you have a question, if you mind, go ahead and type that in, and I'll answer it. But hope you're having a good semester. Hope you're working on your paper. Hope you guys are. I want you to enjoy the process of writing your paper. I know I probably got a laugh from somebody like, yeah, whatever. But I want it to be a learning process, and I want you guys to enjoy the process. And I'll say this, till I'm blue in the face, that I want to be a part of you writing your paper, but I'm not going to approach you. But as much as you want to talk about your paper, I have a lot of time during the day because I drive a lot to talk. And so even in the evenings, keep me posted on your progress. If you run into something you don't understand, or that you just are dying to tell somebody and your wife's tired of hearing about it, call me, because I guarantee you I want to hear about it. But you guys are great. Love you. My wife and I pray for you guys all the time. But we're going to end this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you the next time. See you later.